Good evening, or perhaps it's afternoon where you are. Or maybe you're watching this at 3 in the morning because you've fallen down yet another historical rabbit hole on YouTube. Tonight, we're diving into one of history's most romanticized, yet utterly horrific chapters, the Age of Exploration. But forget everything you think you know about brave sailors conquering the seas for glory and gold. We're about to uncover the staggering, soul-crushing reality of what it actually meant to be a sailor between the 15th and 17th centuries, when life at sea wasn't an adventure. It was a prolonged form of torture that somehow convinced men to sign up anyway. Before we set sail into this storm of suffering, leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. Are you comfortably tucked in bed with a snack while we talk about people eating weevil-infested biscuits and sleeping in puddles of seawater mixed with human waste? Are you sipping fresh orange juice while we discuss sailors whose teeth fell out from scurvy? We absolutely need to know how cushy your life is compared to these poor souls. Picture this. It's 1519, and you're standing on a dock in Seville, watching 5 ships prepare for what would become the first expedition to circumnavigate the globe. Under Ferdinand Magellan, the vessels look impressive from a distance. Towering masts, billowing sails, carved figureheads that seem to promise adventure and riches beyond imagination. The romantic notion of exploration fills the air like morning mist. Young men are practically throwing themselves at recruiters, desperate to join this historic voyage that promises to make them rich and famous. But here's what those recruitment posters didn't mention. Of the 237 men who set sail that day, only 18 would return alive 3 years later, and those 18 survivors, they came back as hollow-eyed, disease-ravaged shadows of their former selves, having witnessed horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their significantly shortened lives. The Age of Exploration, spanning roughly from the late 15th century through the 17th century, was humanity's great push to map the unknown corners of our planet. European powers, Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Dutch Republic were locked in a fierce competition to discover new trade routes, claim new territories, and establish dominance over global commerce. It was the dawn of the first truly global economy, and the potential rewards were astronomical. Spices from the East Indies could be worth more than their weight in gold. A successful voyage could set a man up for life, assuming he lived to enjoy his wealth. But here's the dark truth that history books often gloss over. Maritime exploration during this period wasn't just dangerous, it was a form of legalized suicide with a slim chance of profit. The mortality rate on long voyages regularly exceeded 50%, and on some expeditions it reached as high as 90%. These weren't casualties of war or natural disasters. They were the inevitable result of the absolutely barbaric conditions that defined life aboard an exploration vessel. To understand just how horrific these conditions were, we need to forget every romantic notion Hollywood has ever fed us about life at sea. There were no swashbuckling heroes with perfect teeth and flowing hair. There were no noble captains sharing rum with their loyal crews while gazing at stunning sunsets. The reality was a floating nightmare of disease, starvation, violence, and despair that lasted for months or even years at a time. Let's start with the most basic human need, food. Now, when you're planning a voyage that might last anywhere from 6 months to 3 years, food storage becomes a serious challenge. There's no refrigeration, no preservation technology beyond salt and smoke, and no way to resupply once you're in the middle of an ocean. So what exactly were these brave explorers eating during their epic journeys? the foundation of any sailor's diet was ship's biscuit, also known as hardtack, a tooth-breaking combination of flour and water that was baked until it reached the consistency of concrete. Fresh out of the oven, hardtack was merely unpacked. But after a few weeks at sea, exposed to moisture and infested with weevils, it became a writhing mass of larvae and flour that sailors had to eat in the dark to avoid seeing what they were consuming. The weevils, at least, provided some protein, which was more than could be said for most of their diet. But the weevils were just the beginning. After a month or two at sea, the ship's biscuit would develop a coating of green mold that sailors would scrape off with their knives. When they had knives, and when they had the energy to care, more often than not, they'd just close their eyes and chew, grateful for anything that might fill the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs. The meat situation was even worse, if you can imagine that. Salted pork and beef were packed in barrels at the beginning of the voyage, and for the first few weeks it was merely tough and oversalted. But as time went on and the salt couldn't keep up with the inevitable decay, the meat would take on a greenish hue and develop an aroma that could knock a man unconscious from 10 feet away. Sailors developed techniques for determining if meat was still edible. If you could stick your finger through it without resistance, it was too far gone even for desperate men. If it only bent your finger back, it was considered a delicacy. The smell of rotten meat mixed with bilge water, human waste, and unwashed bodies created an atmosphere so thick and putrid that new sailors would spend their first weeks in a constant state of nausea. Veterans would joke that you knew you were truly a sailor when you could eat your dinner while standing knee-deep in the ship's waste without losing your appetite. Water was another constant nightmare. Fresh water was stored in wooden barrels, and within weeks it would turn green with algae and develop a taste that one sailor described as liquid death with a hint of sulfur. The water would become so foul that even mixing it with wine or beer, when those luxuries were available, couldn't mask the flavor of decay. Many sailors preferred to go thirsty rather than drink the putrid water, which only accelerated their descent into illness and madness. And then there was the beer. Oh, the beer. Because water spoiled so quickly, many ships carried barrels of small beer, a low-alcohol brew that was supposed to stay fresh longer than water. In theory, this was brilliant. In practice, the beer would go sour within weeks, developing a foam that looked suspiciously like soap and a taste that could strip paint. But it was still liquid, and liquid was life. So down it went. The psychological impact of this culinary nightmare cannot be overstated. Imagine spending months eating food that your dog would refuse, drinking water that smells like a swamp, and knowing that this is your reality for the foreseeable future with no possibility of improvement. Sailors would dream about fresh bread, about clean water, about anything that didn't crawl or smell like death. These dreams became so vivid and consuming that men would wake up crying, having tasted imaginary fresh fruit in their sleep. But malnutrition was just the opening act in this theater of suffering. The real killer was scurvy, a disease so devastating that it claimed more sailors' lives than storms, battles, and shipwrecks combined. Scurvy wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was a slow, horrifying death sentence that could transform a healthy man into a walking corpse over the course of a few months. The disease, caused by a lack of vitamin C, would begin subtly. Sailors would notice their gums becoming tender and swollen. Their teeth would start to loosen in their sockets. Small cuts and bruises would refuse to heal, instead growing larger and more infected. But these early symptoms were nothing compared to what came next. As scurvy progressed, a sailor's teeth would begin falling out one by one, making it impossible to chew the already inedible ship's biscuit. Their gums would swell and blacken, sometimes growing so large that they'd completely cover what remained of their teeth. Old wounds would reopen as the body's ability to maintain scar tissue disappeared. New wounds would appear spontaneously, as blood vessels burst under the skin, creating massive, spreading bruises that never healed. The psychological effects were equally devastating. Scurvy victims would become deeply depressed, paranoid, and sometimes violent. They'd develop what sailors called the melancholy, a crushing despair that would make them give up all hope of survival. Some would simply stop eating altogether, welcoming death as a release from their suffering. What made scurvy particularly cruel was that the cure was relatively simple: fresh fruits and vegetables, particularly citrus fruits. But this knowledge wasn't widely accepted or implemented for decades, even after controlled experiments proved that oranges and lemons could cure scurvy. Naval authorities were too stubborn or skeptical to accept the evidence. During those decades, thousands of sailors died from a completely preventable disease simply because of institutional ignorance and pride. The living conditions that created this perfect storm of disease and suffering were almost beyond belief. A typical exploration vessel of the 16th or 17th century was essentially a floating wooden box crammed with far too many people, not enough supplies, and absolutely no consideration for human comfort or sanitation. The average ship might be 100 feet long and 25 feet wide, but most of that space was taken up by cargo, supplies, cannons, and equipment. The actual living space for the crew was usually confined to the lowest deck, a dark, airless cave where men were packed together like cargo. Sailors didn't have individual sleeping quarters or even individual beds. They slept in hammocks strung so close together that a man couldn't turn over without hitting his neighbor. But hammocks were a luxury reserved for officers and senior crew members. Most sailors slept on the bare wooden deck, using coils of rope as pillows and whatever scraps of canvas they could find as blankets. The smell in these quarters was indescribable. Imagine the combined odors of unwashed bodies, rotting food, stagnant water, human waste, and dead rats, all trapped in an enclosed space with no ventilation. The stench was so overwhelming that sailors would often choose to sleep on deck in storms rather than spend a night in the crew quarters. Privacy was non-existent. Men lived, slept, ate, and relieved themselves in full view of their crewmates. The concept of personal space was an impossible luxury. Tensions would build over weeks and months of this forced intimacy, leading to fights over the smallest perceived slights. A man might be murdered over accusations of stealing a moldy biscuit or taking up too much space while sleeping. The ship's toilet facilities, called the head, were located at the front of the ship, where they consisted of nothing more than a few holes cut in the deck with ropes to hold onto. Sailors would relieve themselves while waves crashed over the bow, soaking them with freezing seawater. In rough weather, using the head became a life-threatening activity, as men could easily be washed overboard while in this vulnerable position. But even this primitive system only worked in good weather. During storms, when going on deck was impossible, sailors would relieve themselves wherever they could in the ship's interior. The waste would accumulate in the bilge, the lowest part of the ship, where it would mix with seawater, food scraps, and whatever other refuse had accumulated. This toxic soup would slosh back and forth with every wave, creating an environment so foul that it bred diseases. Unknown to land-dwellers that the bilge water wasn't just disgusting, it was actively dangerous. Ships, carpenters would have to venture into this hellish environment to make repairs, often working waist-deep in a mixture that could kill a man through infection alone. Many sailors developed chronic skin conditions from constant exposure to this contaminated water. Open sores and ulcers were common, and once infected, they rarely healed in the ship's unsanitary conditions. Personal hygiene was virtually impossible. Fresh water was too precious to waste on washing, so sailors went months without bathing. Their clothes would rot off their bodies, leaving many men essentially naked except for whatever scraps of canvas or rope they could fashion into basic coverings. Lice and fleas thrived in this environment, creating a constant torment of itching and biting that could drive men to madness. The psychological toll of these conditions was devastating. Sailors would develop what we'd now recognize as severe depression and anxiety disorders. They'd talk to themselves, have conversations with imaginary companions, or spend hours staring blankly at the horizon. Some would become convinced that their families had forgotten them or died while they were away. Others would become obsessed with the idea that they were already dead and sailing on a ghost ship. Sleep became another form of torture. The constant noise of creaking timbers, crashing waves, snoring men, and scurrying rats made restful sleep nearly impossible. Sailors would often go days with only brief moments of unconsciousness before being jolted awake by the ship's motion, or the screams of a man having nightmares. Chronic sleep deprivation made them prone to accidents, fights, and poor decision-making that could endanger the entire crew. The hierarchy aboard ship created additional layers of suffering for common sailors. The class system at sea was even more brutal than on land, because there was no escape from it. Officers lived in relative luxury, with private cabins, better food, and cleaner clothes. They had servants, real beds, and access to wine and other luxuries that ordinary sailors could only dream about. This stark inequality, visible every day in the confined space of a ship, bred resentment and anger that could explode into violence. Common sailors were treated as expendable labor, barely human in the eyes of their superiors. They were expected to work in conditions that would kill animals, and when they died, their bodies were simply thrown overboard with minimal ceremony. Officers kept detailed records of supplies and equipment, but often didn't even bother to record the names of deceased crew members. A man could live for months in agony and die in obscurity, forgotten before his body hit the water. The work itself was backbreaking and dangerous. Sailors had to climb rigging in storms, handle heavy cargo with primitive equipment, and work around the clock in all weather conditions. Injuries were common and usually fatal. A broken bone meant weeks of agony without proper medical care. A deep cut could lead to infection and death. Men who fell from the rigging might survive the fall only to die slowly from internal injuries, while their crewmates watched helplessly. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of life at sea was the sheer monotony punctuated by moments of terror. For weeks or months at a time, sailors would experience the same routine day after day. Wake up in pain, eat disgusting food, work until exhausted, try to sleep in filthy conditions, and repeat. The horizon never changed. The work never ended. The suffering never stopped. Then, without warning, a storm would hit, and the monotony would be replaced by absolute terror. Waves the size of buildings would crash over the ship, threatening to break it apart or drag it to the bottom of the ocean. Sailors would work desperately to keep the ship afloat, while being battered by wind and waves, knowing that one mistake could kill them all. Many preferred these moments of terror to the endless boredom. At least then they felt alive. The diseases that plagued these voyages went far beyond scurvy. Typhus, spread by the lice that infested every sailor, would sweep through crews like wildfire. Victims would develop high fevers, severe headaches, and a characteristic rash before slipping into delirium and death. Dysentery turned the already horrific sanitary conditions into a nightmare of blood and waste that could kill half a crew in a matter of weeks. Smallpox was another silent killer that could devastate a ship's company. The close quarters ensured that once one person was infected, the disease would spread rapidly through the entire crew. Those who survived were often left permanently disfigured and weakened. Yellow fever, picked up in tropical ports, would cause victims to vomit black blood before dying in agony. The psychological impact of watching crewmates die in such horrible ways was almost as devastating as the diseases themselves. Mental illness was rampant but completely misunderstood. Sailors who broke down psychologically were often accused of cowardice or possession by demons. There was no concept of trauma or mental health treatment. Men who had witnessed too much horror, lost too many friends, or simply couldn't cope with the endless suffering were either restrained like dangerous animals or simply ignored until they died, or threw themselves overboard. The recruitment process that filled these floating death traps with human cargo was itself a masterpiece of deception and desperation. Ship captains and their agents would prowl the docks and taverns of port cities, seeking men desperate enough to sign their lives away for the promise of adventure and riches. They targeted the dregs of society, debtors fleeing creditors, criminals avoiding justice, unemployed farmhands driven from the countryside, and naive young men seduced by tales of exotic lands and easy wealth. The recruiting speeches were works of fiction that would make modern marketing executives weep with envy. Captains would paint pictures of tropical paradises where gold could be picked up from beaches, where native peoples would trade fortunes in spices for a few glass beads, where a man could return home wealthy enough to buy his own estate. They conveniently forgot to mention the 90% mortality rate, the months of eating maggoty food, or the very real possibility of being eaten by cannibals or dying of diseases that would make their victims beg for death. Many recruits were so drunk when they signed their contracts that they had no memory of agreeing to the voyage. Others were victims of what amounted to kidnapping, pressed into service against their will by gangs working for ship owners. The infamous press gangs of the Royal Navy would roam coastal towns, grabbing any man who looked capable of hauling rope, regardless of his wishes or circumstances. Married men would be torn from their families. Skilled craftsmen would be dragged from their workshops, and even clergy weren't immune if they happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Once aboard, there was no turning back. Desertion was punishable by death, and even if a man could somehow escape the ship, he'd likely find himself stranded in a foreign port with no money, no language skills, and no way to return home. The contracts these men signed, if they could read them at all, were essentially suicide pacts disguised as employment agreements. But let's talk about what happened when these men stepped out of line, because the punishment system aboard exploration vessels was designed to break the human spirit as efficiently as possible. The ship's captain had absolute authority over life and death, and he wielded that power with a creativity that would impress professional torturers. Flogging was the most common punishment, but calling it simply whipping doesn't begin to capture the horror of this practice. The Cat O' wasn't just a whip, it was a carefully designed instrument of torture. With 9 knotted cords, that would tear flesh from bone with each stroke. A man sentenced to 50 lashes, a common punishment for minor infractions like talking back to an officer, would be lucky to survive the ordeal. The victim would be tied to the ship's rigging, stripped to the waist, and systematically flayed alive, while his crewmates were forced to watch. The psychological torture was as important as the physical damage. Every sailor knew that he was just one mistake away from feeling the cat's claws on his own back. The sound of the whip cutting through air and tearing into flesh would haunt men's dreams for years. Those who survived flogging often developed infections that killed them slowly over weeks or months, their wounds never properly healing in the ship's filthy conditions. But flogging was merciful compared to keelhauling, a punishment so brutal that it was reserved for the most serious offenses. The victim would be tied to a rope that passed under the ship's hull, then dragged from one side of the vessel to the other. The barnacles and sharp edges on the ship's bottom would tear the man's body to shreds as he was pulled through the water. If he was lucky, he'd drown quickly. If not, he'd emerge on the other side as a barely recognizable mass of torn flesh and broken bones, assuming the sharks hadn't gotten to him first. These punishments weren't aberrations carried out by sadistic captains. They were standard operating procedure, codified in maritime law and considered necessary for maintaining discipline. The logic was simple. Life at sea was so horrible that men would mutiny or desert unless they were even more terrified of the consequences. Fear was the only currency that had any value in this floating hell. Walking the plank, despite its popularity in pirate movies, was actually quite rare. Pirates and naval captains preferred more creative methods of execution. Maroning was far more common and arguably more cruel. Abandoning a man on a deserted island with nothing but a pistol, a bottle of water, and the choice between slow starvation or quick suicide. The psychological torture of watching rescue ships pass in the distance without seeing you was considered part of the punishment. For lesser offenses, sailors might be subjected to running the gauntlet, being forced to walk between two lines of crewmates while each man struck them with knotted ropes, or they might be keelhauled multiple times, each passage under the ship tearing away more flesh until the victim was unrecognizable. Some captains preferred to chain offenders to the deck during storms, letting nature provide the punishment as waves crashed over the helpless victim for hours or days. The threat of mutiny hung over every voyage like a sword. Captains knew that they were vastly outnumbered by men who had every reason to want them dead. The crew's suffering could only be pushed so far before desperation overcame fear. And when that happened, the results were usually catastrophic for everyone involved. Successful mutinies were rare, but when they occurred, they often led to even worse outcomes than the original voyage. Mutinous crews rarely had the navigation skills to get home safely, and they knew that if they were caught, they'd face execution. Many mutinous ships simply disappeared, their crews dying slowly of starvation and disease in some remote corner of the ocean. Others turned to piracy, only to be hunted down by naval forces and hanged. Failed mutinies resulted in mass executions that would decimate the remaining crew. Captains would make examples of suspected ringleaders by inflicting punishments so brutal that they'd cow the survivors into submission. The Spanish explorer Vasco Nunes de Balboa dealt with one mutiny attempt by having the suspected leaders fed to his dogs while the rest of the crew watched. This wasn't considered excessive. It was seen as necessary leadership. The rigid class system aboard ships created additional layers of misery that made life unbearable for common sailors. The social hierarchy was even more brutal at sea than on land. because there was absolutely no escape from it. You couldn't quit your job, move to another town, or find a new master. You were trapped in a floating caste system where your birth determined every aspect of your existence until death released you from service. At the top of this pyramid sat the captain, who lived like a king while his crew suffered like slaves. Captains had private cabins furnished with real beds, chairs, tables, and even libraries. They ate fresh food prepared by personal servants, drank imported wine, and wore clean clothes made from fine fabrics. Their quarters were cleaned daily. Their meals were served on actual plates, and they had access to medical care when they fell ill. Just below the captain were the officers, the master, pilot, surgeon, and various mates who formed the ship's aristocracy. These men had private or semi-private quarters, better food rations, and the authority to beat common sailors for any perceived slight. They wore uniforms that distinguished them from the rabble, carried weapons that ordinary crew members were forbidden to touch, and enjoyed privileges that seemed impossibly luxurious to men sleeping in their own waste. The skilled tradesmen, carpenters, sailmakers, cooks, and gunners, occupied the middle tier of this hierarchy. They had slightly better accommodations, marginally more food, and the relative security that came with specialized knowledge. But they were still subject to the same brutal punishments as ordinary sailors, and their skills often made them targets for abuse from jealous officers who resented their independence. At the bottom of this social pyramid were the ordinary seamen, the vast majority of any crew who existed in conditions that would be considered inhumane for animals. These men had no rights, no privacy, no comfort, and no hope of advancement. They were literally expendable, valued less than the rope and canvas that kept the ship functioning. When they died, they were replaced at the next port like broken tools. The psychological impact of this rigid hierarchy was devastating. Imagine being trapped for months or years with people who lived in luxury while you suffered in squalor, knowing that your pain was considered not just acceptable, but necessary for their comfort. The resentment and rage that built up under these conditions could drive men to murder, suicide, or complete mental breakdown. But even more terrifying than human cruelty was the ocean itself. The Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans during the Age of Exploration were largely unmapped territories filled with hazards that could destroy ships and crews without warning. Storms that lasted for weeks would batter vessels until their hulls split and their masts snapped. Sailors would work frantically to keep their ships afloat while being bombarded by waves that could crush a man like an insect. The psychological impact of these storms was almost as destructive as the physical damage. Imagine being trapped in a wooden box while nature tries to kill you for days on end. The constant motion would leave men seasick and disoriented. The noise, creaking timbers, howling wind, crashing waves would be so overwhelming the sailors couldn't hear their own thoughts. Many would go temporarily insane from the stress, screaming or weeping uncontrollably until the storm passed. When ships were wrecked, and many were, the survivors faced a nightmare scenario that made their previous suffering seem like luxury. Those lucky enough to reach land often found themselves stranded on uninhabited islands or hostile coasts with no food, no fresh water, and no hope of rescue. They'd watch their crewmates die one by one from exposure, starvation, or disease while desperately scanning the horizon for ships that would never come. The Batavia disaster of 1629 provides a perfect example of how bad things could get. This Dutch East India Company ship was wrecked on coral reefs off the coast of Australia with 316 people aboard. The initial wreck was just the beginning of their nightmare. Survivors found themselves stranded on small islands with limited water and no food. Within days, a group of mutineers had seized control and begun systematically murdering other survivors to conserve resources. By the time rescue arrived months later, only 68 people were still alive, and many of those were traumatized beyond recovery. But let's delve deeper into the specific horror of being shipwrecked, because the Batavia incident wasn't unique. It was just one of hundreds of similar disasters that claimed thousands of lives during this period. When a ship ran aground or broke apart in a storm, the survivors often faced choices that would haunt them for the rest of their shortened lives. Take the case of the Portuguese Coração João, which was wrecked off the coast of South Africa. In 1552, the survivors, including noblemen, their wives, and hundreds of sailors and soldiers, found themselves stranded on a hostile coast with no supplies and no hope of rescue. What followed was a months-long death march along the African coast, during which the social order completely collapsed. Noblewomen who had never walked more than a few steps, without assistance, were forced to trek through wilderness for hundreds of miles. Children died in their parents' arms. Men who had served together for years turned on each other over scraps of food or drops of water. The psychological transformation of these survivors was perhaps more horrifying than their physical suffering. Portuguese chroniclers recorded how refined ladies were reduced to fighting over roots and berries, how gentlemen murdered fellow survivors for their shoes, how the veneer of civilization stripped away to reveal the animal desperation beneath. By the time the few survivors reached Portuguese settlements months later, they were unrecognizable physically, mentally, and morally destroyed by their ordeal. Navigation during this period was more art than science, which meant that sailors often had no idea where they were or where they were going. Captains relied on crude maps that were often wildly inaccurate, compass readings that could be thrown off by magnetic anomalies, and celestial navigation techniques that were useless during cloudy weather. Ships would sometimes sail for months in the wrong direction before realizing their mistake. The psychological torture of being lost at sea was devastating. Columbus himself experienced this during his fourth voyage, when he spent months wandering in what is now the Caribbean, convinced he was somewhere near India. His crew, already weakened by disease and malnutrition, began to believe they were sailing in circles, doomed to wander until they died. Some sailors developed what modern psychologists would recognize as dissociative disorders, losing track of time and reality as the endless days of sailing nowhere took their toll. Getting lost wasn't just disorienting, it was a death sentence. Supplies were calculated based on expected journey times, so any significant delay meant starvation. Water rations would be cut to amounts so small that men's tongues would swell and crack. Food would run out entirely, forcing crews to eat leather, rope, canvas, and anything else remotely organic they could find aboard the ship. When desperation reached its peak, crews sometimes resorted to cannibalism. This wasn't the dramatic, sudden decision portrayed in movies. It was a gradual descent into horror that began with eating the dead and sometimes progressed to murder for food. The Portuguese explorer Pedro Álvares Cabral fleet experienced this nightmare during their voyage to India in 1500. One ship became separated from the fleet and was presumed lost. But survivors later reported that the crew had devoured each other during months of wandering in the South Atlantic. The psychological impact of cannibalism was devastating for survivors. Many who resorted to eating human flesh never recovered mentally, developing what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD. They'd be haunted by nightmares, unable to eat meat without vomiting, and often took their own lives rather than live with the memories of what they'd done to survive. Encounters with indigenous peoples during this era were often disasters for both sides, but sailors usually got the worst of it. Europeans would arrive in foreign lands weakened by months of poor nutrition and disease, only to face peoples who knew the terrain, had access to fresh food and water, and were understandably hostile to armed strangers arriving uninvited on their shores. The massacre of Portuguese sailors in the Moluccas in 1512 illustrates the deadly consequences of these encounters. A Portuguese expedition seeking spices found themselves welcomed initially by local rulers, but tensions quickly escalated when the Europeans began making demands and showing disrespect for local customs. When violence erupted, the Portuguese sailors, already weakened by months at sea, were systematically hunted down and killed. Those few who escaped did so by hiding in swamps for weeks, drinking contaminated water and eating roots until they were barely recognizable as human beings. But indigenous peoples weren't the only threat sailors faced in foreign lands. European diseases that seemed minor in their homeland became deadly killers in tropical climates. Malaria, yellow fever, and dengue fever claimed more European lives than all the wars and accidents combined. Sailors who survived the voyage to the tropics often died within days of reaching their destination, their bodies unable to cope with diseases for which they had no immunity. Pirates added another layer of terror to maritime exploration. These weren't the romantic figures of Hollywood movies. They were desperate, violent men who viewed merchant ships as floating treasure chests to be looted without mercy. A pirate attack could be worse than a storm or a disease outbreak because it combined the threat of death with the certainty of torture. Pirates developed sophisticated methods of torture designed to extract information about hidden cargo or to simply satisfy their sadistic impulses. They'd keel-halt prisoners repeatedly, burn them with hot irons, or force them to drink boiling oil. The notorious pirate Francois L'Olonnais was famous for cutting out prisoners' hearts and eating them while they were still alive. These weren't isolated incidents carried out by madmen. They were standard operating procedures designed to strike terror into the hearts of merchant sailors. Those who survived pirate attacks were often marooned on deserted islands or forced to join the pirate crew, a choice between slow death by starvation or a criminal life that would inevitably end on the gallows. Many chose the pirates, reasoning that a short life of relative freedom was better than slow death by abandonment. The slave trade added another dimension of horror to maritime exploration, as ships engaged in human trafficking faced unique challenges that made already brutal conditions even worse. Slave ships carried hundreds of kidnapped Africans in conditions so appalling that they made ordinary sailor quarters seem luxurious. The mortality rate among enslaved people was often above 50%, but sailors didn't fare much better. Disease spread rapidly in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions, and slave revolts were constant threats that could result in the deaths of entire crews. Sailors on slave ships lived in constant fear of uprising, knowing that if the enslaved people broke free, they'd be slaughtered without mercy. The psychological impact of participating in this human trafficking was devastating, even for men already hardened by years of brutality. Many sailors who survived slave voyages became alcoholics or suffered from what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD, unable to function in normal society after witnessing such systematic cruelty. The famous slave ship revolts, like the one aboard the Amistad in 1839, were nightmares for surviving crew members. Those who lived through such uprisings described scenes of unimaginable violence as desperate people fought for their freedom with chains, improvised weapons, and bare hands. The psychological trauma of these experiences followed sailors for the rest of their lives, assuming they survived long enough to have the rest of their lives. Medical care aboard ships was virtually non-existent, which turned minor injuries into death sentences and made serious illnesses into extended torture sessions. Ship surgeons were usually failed doctors or drunken quacks who had as much chance of killing their patients as curing them. Their medical kit consisted mainly of saws for amputations, crude needles for stitching wounds, and bottles of alcohol that served as both anesthetic and antiseptic. Amputations were performed without proper anesthesia, with the patient held down by crewmates while the surgeon sawed through bone and flesh. The screams of the patient would echo through the ship, terrorizing other crew members who knew they might be next. Many patients died from shock during the procedure, while others succumbed to infection in the days that followed. Those who survived often faced a lifetime of disability that made them useless for further sea service, leaving them to beg in port cities or die in poverty. Dental care was even more primitive and equally horrifying. Tooth extraction was performed with crude pliers, often taking part of the jaw with the tooth. Sailors would develop abscesses and gum disease that made eating their already horrible food nearly impossible. Some would resort to pulling their own teeth rather than face the ship's surgeon, using whatever tools they could find and hoping they wouldn't die from the resulting infection. The psychological impact of living with constant, untreatable pain was devastating, driving many sailors to suicide or violence. The diseases that plagued these voyages went far beyond scurvy and created floating houses of horror that would have impressed the operators of medieval torture chambers. Typhus, spread by the lice that infested every sailor, would sweep through crews like wildfire. Victims would develop high fevers, severe headaches, and a characteristic rash before slipping into delirium and death. The disease was so contagious that entire crews could be wiped out within weeks of the first case appearing. Dysentery turned the already horrific sanitary conditions into a nightmare of blood and waste that could kill half a crew in a matter of weeks. Victims would suffer from constant, bloody diarrhea that dehydrated them rapidly while filling the ship with an even more unbearable stench than usual. The psychological impact of watching strong men reduced to helpless invalids, soiling themselves and begging for death, was almost as devastating as the disease itself. Smallpox was another silent killer that could devastate a ship's company. The close quarters ensured that once one person was infected, the disease would spread rapidly through the entire crew. Those who survived were often left permanently disfigured and weakened, their faces scarred by pox marks that marked them as plague survivors for the rest of their lives. Yellow fever, picked up in tropical ports, would cause victims to vomit black blood before dying in agony. The disease earned the nickname Yellowjack because of how it turned victims' skin a sickly yellow color before killing them. Entire expeditions were wiped out by yellow fever, leaving ships full of corpses drifting aimlessly until they ran aground or sank. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of disease aboard these ships was watching friends and crewmates transform into something barely human before dying horrible deaths. Men would witness their closest companions develop scurvy until their teeth fell out and their gums turned black, then watch them slowly starve to death because they couldn't chew food. they'd see strong sailors reduced to skeletal figures covered in festering sores, begging for death while clinging to life with desperate tenacity. The death toll from these voyages was so catastrophic that it became a routine part of maritime life. Bodies were thrown overboard with minimal ceremony, wrapped in canvas if the crew was feeling generous or had canvas to spare. Sharks learned to follow exploration ships, knowing that regular meals would be provided. The psychological impact of watching crewmates die and disappear beneath the waves was profound, contributing to the fatalistic attitude that characterized most sailors. Some voyagers lost so many men that they couldn't properly operate their ships. Survivors would find themselves trying to handle vessels designed for crews twice their size, leading to more accidents and deaths. The Vicente Llanes Pinzon expedition of Issa Jojo lost so many sailors to disease and violence that the survivors had to abandon one of their ships because they didn't have enough men to sail it home. The abandoned vessel was left to drift, presumably with the bodies of dead crew members still aboard. But let's examine some specific expeditions to understand just how horrific these mortality rates really were. Magellan's famous circumnavigation is often celebrated as one of humanity's greatest achievements, but the human cost was almost beyond comprehension. Of the 5 ships and 237 men who departed Seville in 1519, only 1 ship and 18 men returned in 1522. That's a mortality rate of over 92%. And those 18 survivors weren't the same men who had left 3 years earlier. They were hollow-eyed, disease-ravaged shadows who had witnessed horrors that would define the rest of their shortened lives. Juan Sebastian Elcano, who commanded the surviving ship Victoria after Magellan's death, described his crew as more dead than alive when they finally reached Spain. The survivors were so weakened by malnutrition and disease that they could barely walk. Several died within days of reaching home, their bodies finally giving up after years of abuse. Those who lived longer were haunted by nightmares, unable to eat certain foods without vomiting, and prone to violent outbursts, triggered by memories of their ordeal. The psychological transformation these men underwent was as dramatic as their physical deterioration. Antonio Pigafetta, who chronicled the voyage, wrote about crew members who became convinced they were already dead and sailing in purgatory. Others developed obsessive behaviors, like counting the same objects over and over, or having long conversations with imaginary companions. Some became catatonic, staring blankly at the horizon for hours while their bodies slowly wasted away. Vasco da Gama's pioneering voyage to India in 1497 to 1499 provides another example of the human cost of exploration. Da Gama left Lisbon with 164 men and returned with fewer than 60 survivors, a mortality rate of over 60%. But the numbers don't tell the full story of what those men endured. During the voyage, scurvy became so severe that sailors' gums would grow over their teeth, making eating impossible. The ship's chronicler described men whose legs were so swollen with fluid that the skin would burst, releasing putrid liquid that added to the ship's already overwhelming stench. The psychological impact of watching comrades suffer such horrible deaths was devastating. Da Gama's crew developed a fatalistic acceptance of death that bordered on the supernatural. They'd gamble with each other over who would die next, treating mortality like a game of chance rather than a tragedy. Some sailors became convinced that death was following them personally, developing paranoid delusions that would persist for years after their return. But perhaps no expedition better illustrates the absolute horror of exploration voyages than The Dutch expedition, led by Jacob van Heemskerk in 1596, which became trapped in Arctic ice near Novia. The crew was forced to spend an entire winter in the Arctic, building a makeshift shelter from ship timbers and enduring months of complete darkness, temperatures that froze their breath, and isolation that drove many men insane. The psychological toll of spending months in perpetual darkness cannot be overstated. Sailors developed what we'd now recognize as severe seasonal affective disorder, combined with claustrophobia, paranoia, and suicidal ideation. They'd fight over meaningless disputes, have elaborate conversations with hallucinated companions, or spend days staring at walls without speaking. Some became convinced that the sun would never return, that they were trapped in eternal night as punishment for their sins. The cold was so severe that men's clothes would freeze solid, making movement painful and difficult. Their shelter filled with smoke from their fires, creating an atmosphere so thick that breathing became laborious. Food supplies dwindled to nothing, forcing them to eat their leather boots, strips of canvas, and eventually to consider cannibalism. When rescue finally came the following summer, several crew members had gone completely insane and never recovered their sanity. The experience of being trapped in ice was repeated by countless Arctic expeditions, each one resulting in death, madness, and trauma that would haunt survivors for decades. The psychological impact of facing the absolute indifference of nature, of realizing that the universe didn't care whether you lived or died, was perhaps more devastating than any physical hardship. Let's also examine the horror of tropical expeditions, which presented entirely different but equally deadly challenges. When Europeans first attempted to establish permanent settlements in tropical regions, the mortality rates were so high that some colonies had to be resupplied with new colonists multiple times per year, just to maintain their population. The first English attempt to colonize Roanoke Island in 1585 illustrates this tropical nightmare perfectly. The colonists, led by Ralph Lane, found themselves in a hostile environment where European diseases provided no protection against local pathogens, where familiar food wouldn't grow, and where the climate itself seemed designed to kill them. Within months, colonists were dying from diseases they'd never encountered, succumbing to infections that would have been minor back home, and developing mental illnesses triggered by the stress of constant fear and isolation. The psychological impact of tropical colonization was devastating in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. Colonists would develop what they called tropical madness, a combination of heat exhaustion, disease, isolation, and terror that would drive them to violence, suicide, or complete mental breakdown. They'd become convinced that the landscape itself was evil, that native peoples were demons, or that they were being punished by God for their sins. The infamous lost colony of Roanoke represents the ultimate expression of this tropical nightmare. When supply ships finally reached the colony in 1590, they found it completely abandoned, with no trace of the 115 colonists who had been left there 3 years earlier. The only clue was the word Croatoan carved into a post, but what happened to those people remains one of history's most haunting mysteries. Did they die from disease? Were they killed by hostile natives? Did they go insane and murder each other? Or did they simply walk into the wilderness and disappear, driven mad by the psychological pressure of their situation? The impact of these voyages on the families left behind adds another layer of tragedy to this story. Women would watch their husbands, sons, and brothers sail away, knowing there was a good chance they'd never see them again. The psychological toll on these families was enormous. Wives would spend years not knowing whether they were widows or still married. Children would grow up without fathers, and entire communities would be depleted of young men. But even worse than the uncertainty was the condition of those who did return. Survivors of exploration voyages were often so physically and mentally damaged that they couldn't resume normal lives. They'd suffer from chronic pain, disability, and psychological trauma that made them unable to work, maintain relationships, or function in society. Many became alcoholics, trying to drown memories of horrors they couldn't articulate to people who had never experienced such suffering. The economic system that drove these voyages was built on the assumption that human lives were expendable resources to be consumed in the pursuit of profit. Ship owners calculated crew mortality into their business plans the same way they calculated losses from spoiled cargo or storm damage. A successful voyage was one that returned with enough valuable cargo to offset the cost of the ship, supplies, and crew, regardless of how many men died in the process. This commodification of human life had profound psychological effects on everyone involved in the maritime trade. Captains learned to view their crews as disposable tools rather than human beings, while sailors developed a fatalistic acceptance of death that often manifested as reckless behavior, chronic depression, or explosive violence. The entire system was designed to strip away humanity in the service of commercial success. The technological limitations of the era made every aspect of these voyages more dangerous and psychologically traumatic. Without accurate timekeeping devices, navigators couldn't determine longitude, meaning ships could wander for months without knowing their location. Without understanding of nutrition, crews would develop scurvy even when fresh food was available. Without knowledge of disease transmission, ships became floating plague vessels that killed their occupants. Through ignorance as much as hardship, but perhaps most damaging was the complete lack of understanding about mental health and psychological trauma. Sailors who broke down mentally were viewed as cowards, madmen, or victims of supernatural possession. There was no concept of treating psychological wounds, no understanding of how extreme stress could permanently damage the human mind, and no support systems for men who had witnessed unimaginable horrors. The religious context of these voyages added another layer of psychological torture. Most sailors were deeply religious, and they interpreted their suffering through a theological lens that often made their trauma worse. They'd become convinced that their ordeal was divine punishment for their sins, that God had abandoned them, or that they were trapped in a kind of maritime purgatory. Some developed religious mania, convinced they were chosen for special suffering or destined for martyrdom. The Catholic and Protestant sailors of this era were raised to believe in a just and loving God, but their experiences at sea challenged these beliefs in ways that often led to complete spiritual breakdown. How could a loving God allow such pointless suffering? Why would divine providence permit good men to die horrible deaths while evil men prospered? These theological questions could drive sailors to despair, madness, or a cynical rejection of all religious belief. Now, as we near the end of our journey through this maritime hell, it's important to understand that these horrific experiences weren't meaningless suffering. These brutal voyages, terrible as they were for the men who endured them, fundamentally changed the world in ways we're still living with today. The age of exploration created the first truly global economy, connecting distant continents through trade networks that brought spices from Asia, gold from the Americas, and slaves from Africa to European markets. The profits from these voyages funded the scientific revolution, the Renaissance, and the eventual Industrial Revolution. The maps drawn by suffering sailors guided future generations of explorers, merchants, and colonizers. But the human cost of building this interconnected world was almost beyond calculation. Hundreds of thousands of sailors died horrible deaths to create the maritime routes that we now take for granted. Entire civilizations were destroyed by diseases brought by exploration ships. Millions of people were enslaved and transported across oceans in conditions that made sailor quarters seem luxurious. The psychological trauma inflicted on survivors shaped entire cultures and societies. The fatalistic acceptance of death that characterized maritime communities influenced art, literature, and philosophy for centuries. The brutal hierarchy aboard ships became a model for colonial administration and industrial management. The commodification of human life that made exploration profitable laid the groundwork for the exploitation that would define much of the modern world, even today. We live in a world shaped by the consequences of these voyages. The global trade networks that bring us everything from coffee to smartphones follow routes first mapped by dying sailors. The economic systems that generate our prosperity are descended from the same logic that treated human lives as expendable resources. The psychological techniques used to maintain discipline aboard exploration ships influenced military training, prison management, and corporate culture. The cities we live in, the foods we eat, the languages we speak, and the technologies we use all bear the imprint of those horrific voyages. Every time you bite into chocolate, drink coffee, or use spices in your cooking, you're consuming products that were first brought to global markets by men who suffered and died in ways we can barely imagine. The exploration of the Americas led to the destruction of indigenous civilizations and the creation of colonial economies based on plantation, agriculture, and slave labor. The European colonization of Asia disrupted ancient trade networks and imposed new economic systems designed to extract wealth for European markets. The mapping of Africa enabled the slave trade that transported millions of people across the Atlantic in conditions that killed them by the hundreds of thousands. But we shouldn't romanticize this suffering or pretend that it was somehow noble or necessary. The men who died on exploration ships weren't heroes dying for a great cause. They were victims of an economic system that valued profit over human life. Their deaths weren't meaningful sacrifices that advanced human knowledge. They were preventable tragedies caused by greed, ignorance, and callous disregard for human welfare. The knowledge gained from these voyages could have been acquired through methods that didn't require such massive human sacrifice. The economic benefits could have been achieved through systems that didn't treat sailors as disposable resources. The global connections that resulted from exploration could have been established through more humane means as we sit here today, comfortable in our homes with easy access to food, clean water, medical care, and global communication. It's worth taking a moment to acknowledge the human cost of the world we've inherited. Every convenience we enjoy, every freedom we take for granted, every opportunity we have to travel safely across the globe, was built on the suffering of countless men who died in agony on the world's oceans. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine what it would have been like to be one of those sailors. Picture yourself trapped for months in a wooden box smaller than your bedroom, surrounded by men slowly dying from diseases you don't understand. Imagine eating food crawling with maggots, drinking water that tastes like death, and watching your teeth fall out one by one while your gums turn black. Feel the constant motion of the ship making you sick, the stench of human waste and rotting flesh filling your nostrils. The absolute certainty that you will never see your family again. Imagine The psychological horror of watching your best friend's body thrown overboard to feed the sharks, of lying awake at night listening to men scream in their sleep, of slowly realizing that you're probably going to die in agony thousands of miles from home. Think about the desperation that would drive you to eat leather and canvas, the madness that would make you hallucinate conversations with dead crewmates, the despair that would make death seem like a blessing rather than a tragedy. This was the reality for hundreds of thousands of men during the age of exploration. Their suffering wasn't abstract or distant. It was immediate, personal, and absolutely real. They felt every moment of pain, every pang of hunger, every wave of nausea, every spike of terror that we've described. They were human beings with hopes, fears, dreams, and families, reduced to expendable resources in humanity's drive to map and exploit the world. So the next time you effortlessly order something online that arrives from across the globe, or step aboard an airplane for a journey that would have taken months and killed half the passengers just a few centuries ago, take a moment to remember the men who died to make your comfort possible. Their names are mostly forgotten, their stories largely untold, but their suffering echoes through history and shaped the world we live in today. The age of exploration was humanity's first great leap toward becoming a truly global species, but it was built on a foundation of human misery that we're only beginning to understand. The brave sailors of popular imagination were real people who endured real horrors to create the interconnected world we now inhabit. Their legacy isn't just the maps they drew or the trade routes they established. It's also the reminder that progress often comes at a human cost that we're too comfortable to fully acknowledge.